The central starting point is in the middle of the trunk, on the plexus. It's a black head that looks like one of my childhood licorice sweets. I bend my head over my trunk to take an even closer look, and realize that thing has eyes, and it talks. I ask it, "What are you doing here?" "You called me," she says. "I served you," tu in French, "and I don't serve you," vous in French. She smiles at me, and her eyes blink calmly, sweetly, and gently. She falls asleep as I slowly put my head back in a straight position. I'm both scared and also tell myself that there's no reason for being scared, for if it was dangerous, I'd already be dead, since it's been there forever anyway. Nevertheless, I'd better show this to a physician. I go to the general hospital, where I'm told by a doctor that he's not competent in this matter, and he gives me a tiny piece of paper with an address written on it, where I shall find someone competent. I go there, and it's the office of my analyst. As I walk up the outside steps, I realize the plaque does not bear his name anymore. In fact, it says alchemist instead. A man opens the door, and I recognize him. He really is the alchemist, the one who once in my life introduced me to the Black Land, and who died several years ago. I feel very touched seeing him again, and full of respect towards him. "What am I doing here?" I ask. "Well," he says, "don't you know? There are billions of human beings on this planet, and yet only 12 will succeed in their journey and make it here to my place. You are here to see the silence." He leads me down a corridor. At this point, and even when I write this dream, I have tears falling from my eyes in a form of ecstatic contentment, grace, and joy. I feel like thanking God for this. He opens a door to a room in which from the ceiling hangs a mobile with 2 branches. Above the 2 branches stand 2 luminaries. On the left, a sun. Below the sun, a double-headed solar axe. On the right, a moon. And below it, a Foucault pendulum. The dream is complex, and it would take too much time to explore it fully. Still, I would like to emphasize some of the dream narrative and language. In so doing, I stay close to the images as they present themselves, in order to hear them speak in a phenomenological way, leaving aside most of the dreamer's personal associations. The dreamer begins in an armchair in a somewhat relaxed and casual position. What at first appears to him is a little blemish on the sole, S-O-L-E, sole, S-O-U-L, of his foot. The sound connection of soul and soul is often useful in entering into the inner meaning and sight of the dream. What is going on is not simply in his literal foot, but also in his dream or subtle body. Something is appearing in a critical place in the soul, a place that grounds and links him to earth, to the place he stands on, his foundation. Although what's going on at this site seems just a small thing, the dream ego flips itself over to take a closer look. This gesture in dreams is quite common. A second look reflects a movement toward consciousness and shows something more to the dreamer than is available at a causal first glance. The dream ego applies some pressure to this blemish, as if to squeeze out something that is under the surface. From this point, a black liquid like a filament starts to flow out. When the dream ego turns away with the intent of just wiping it away, the blackness disappears under the surface, as is often the case when dealing with unconscious contents. This dreamer remains curious and presses forward again. As he does so, the blackness reappears and multiplies threefold. He now tries to grab hold of it, and as he does so, it becomes more solid and has an elastic texture. He then tries to eliminate it by pulling it out of his body, but discovers that it is more deeply and firmly rooted than he had thought. Once again, this kind of image is not uncommon in dreams. I have seen it on a number of occasions in which dreamers are trying to pull something out of their mouth, only to discover that it is fastened deeply within the body and cannot be pulled out. Sometimes, this refers to an inability to say something that one is having a hard time expressing. The intensity of a conflict keeps it deeply connected to the body and the unconscious. For this dreamer, there seems to be a continuing desire to be rid of this black stuff, but a more than equal desire to understand something about the darkness within. He brings his head down to his foot, signifying a change in perspective, a descent of the head to the lowest part of the body, a coming down of consciousness to see what is going on at the place of the soul, and of blackness. As he does so, he discovers something that he had not seen before. The pimple is not just a pimple any longer, but has become a hole, actually several holes, through which he discovers something alive and breathing. The dreamer's persistent desire to see what is going on is met by the subtle body becoming transparent. He can now see inside. Black filaments are everywhere, and he sees a black beast living inside himself. As one might imagine, to discover this kind of unknown otherness inside of oneself, as part of oneself, is terrifying and monstrous. Yet the dreamer continues to try to determine where all this is leading. He follows the blackness in its spider-like intricacy throughout his whole body, which is now transparent. This web of tentacles is spread everywhere inside him. The change from casual curiosity to existential fear provokes a desire to get to the bottom of things, to the origin and source of the blackness itself. The source is discovered in the solar plexus, a place where, in literal physiology, a large network of sympathetic nerves and ganglia meet behind the stomach and form a hard, sun-like center. In our dreamer, these nerves appear as black tentacles, creating what one might possibly imagine as a black sun center in the pit of the stomach. Here, an important vision occurs. The dark center appears as a black head that has eyes and can see and speak to him. For the first time, he addresses this darkness and meets it head to head, as if engaged in a spontaneous active imagination. There is a long tradition of head symbolism in alchemy and early literature, linking it both to the Nigredo experience and to our human potential for transformation. E.G.Plott believes that one reason seems to be the connection between the term head and top or beginning. Blackness was considered to be the starting point of the alchemical work. E.G.Plott notes that the head also symbolizes the rotundum, the round, complete man. The separated head and symbolism of beheading reflects this wholeness as extracted from the empirical man. The head or skull becomes the round vessel of transformation. In one text, it was the head of the black Osiris or Ethiopian that, when boiled, turned into gold. For our dreamer, the head takes on a less fearsome quality and stimulates sweet memories of childhood, but it also becomes a paradoxical interlocutor. The dreamer asks, "What are you doing here?" "You called me." She answers, "I serve you, and I don't serve you." These paradoxical responses make clear that the black head is duplex and mercurial, and reflects the complexity of the unconscious psyche, which is both trickster and guide. It is both male and female. It serves the ego, and yet doesn't serve the ego. In this sense, one might imagine this head as a prefiguration of the self or of the whole man, which is never simply a sweet experience. What can it mean that the head serves and doesn't serve? Jung poignantly expresses this paradox when he says, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." Moreover, the oracular head symbolizes the consulting of one's wholeness for information beyond the ego. In this sense, the black head and or skull is a signifier of the memento mori, the existential knowledge of our own death. E.G.Plott states that it is an emblem for the operation of mortificatio. It generates reflections on one's personal mortality and serves as a touchstone for true and false values. To reflect on death can lead one to view life under the aspect of eternity, and thus, the black death head can turn to gold. In confrontation with the life of the psyche, the paradoxical truth is that such engagement brings both defeat and transformation, death and new life. This truth is difficult to assimilate if it can be said to be assimilable at all. For Perhaps it is better to say it is the ego that is assimilated, not into the unconscious, but into the larger life of the soul. A move that, as Hillman has said, places man within psyche, rather than psyche within man. Such a process feels like a great danger to the ego, as if it is in danger of dying. This anxiety leads the dreamer to a medical doctor who indicates that in these matters he is not competent. So one might imagine that what the dreamer is dealing with is not in the realm of the medical body. Next, the dreamer goes to see his analyst, but the analyst no longer occupies the same place as he once did. His space has become occupied by an alchemist. For the dreamer, it appears that the psyche is suggesting that help is not to be found in the realm of either medicine or psychoanalysis. So the psyche places the dreamer into connection with an alchemist, with memory, image, and depth within his own soul, as he recalls the man who had introduced him to the Black Land, and who died several years ago. The dreamer feels touched and full of respect, and now asks an important question. What am I doing here? With this, a deeper dialogue is initiated with the alchemist, who calls him by name and tells him that he is here to see the silence. This is a statement of the phenomenon of synesthesia. Synesthesia is traditionally understood as a condition in which one type of stimulation evokes the stimulation of another. It takes the dreamer out of his experience of the ordinary empirical world and returns him to one in which silence is not simply heard, but also seen. Merleau-Ponty notes that from this perspective, the objective world and the objective body with its separate organ is often felt to be paradoxical. The phenomenon of synesthetic experience is rather common, but we have lost sight of it because immersion in a scientific Weltanschauung has shifted the center of gravity of experience so that we have unlearned how to see, hear, and generally speaking, feel. We have left our natural lived bodies and deduced from our bodily organization a way of experiencing that is modeled on the physicist's conception of the world of perception. If Merleau-Ponty is correct, it is not surprising why knowledge of the objective medical body is inadequate to understand the dreamer's experiences. From this perspective, sight and hearing in our everyday constructed mode are not fundamental in our experience. Might we imagine, then, that the alchemist is pointing our dreamer toward a return to both the more primordial way of seeing and to the lived rather than the objectified body? For Merleau-Ponty, the lived body refers to something quite different from the body, seen as an object of mechanistic physiology or of classical psychology. For him, as for our dreamer, biology and psychology are not the sources of the deepest understanding of our human existence. Rather, Merleau-Ponty speaks of a reawakening of our fundamental ground and of the strangeness and miracle of perception. Such a strange perception occurs in our dreamer. As the alchemist leads him down the corridor, he is ecstatic and has a feeling of contentment, grace, and joy. He feels like thanking God. The dream ends with the alchemist opening the door to a final, complex, luminous, and mysterious vision, a mobile of the sun and moon. The theme of the juxtaposed sun and the moon is common in alchemy and psychologically represents the tension and or play of the opposites, of day and night, rational and irrational, conscious and unconscious. In another picture, opposite flames are held by the male and female and merge in the alchemist's flask. The sun and the moon appear above the flask. Fabricius writes below the image, lighting the fire of oneness in a furrow between two waves of the mercurial sea. Thus, we might imagine that part of our dreamer's vision has to do with the bringing together of the so-called opposites reflected in the dual snakes entwined around the caduceus near the right knee of the kneeling figure. The sun and moon perspectives are further differentiated by the images of the solar axe and Foucault's pendulum in the dream. The individual symbolism of the dreamer complicates the traditional images of the sun and the moon and gives them further articulation, truly creating a complexio oppositorum, similar to the tension in the alchemical engravings we produced earlier. The alchemist here opens a way for the dreamer to contemplate a vision of the opposites suspended on a mobile, which holds a coincidence of sun and moon, light and darkness. These images hang together in a mysterious suspension, appearing at the end of the dreamer's journey, as if responding to the unanswered questioning at the core of blackness itself. The images of the solar axe and Foucault's pendulum add to the mystery of this final image. But here I comment only on the notion of the mobile itself. The mobile is a term said to be coined by artist Marcel Duchamp in 1932 to describe the kinetic sculptures of Alexander Calder, who was also a painter of a black sun. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential philosopher and writer, wrote the following of Calder's invention. A mobile does not suggest anything. It captures genuine living movement and shapes them. Mobiles have no meaning, make you think of nothing but themselves. They are. That is all. There is more of the unpredictable about them than in any other human creation. They are nevertheless at once lyrical inventions, technical contributions of an almost mathematical quality, and sensitive symbols of nature. The mobile might well be imagined as another provocative model of the self. Sun and moon are not joined into any fusion, but each image has its distinctive place. They hang together in a strange balance, turning according to the movement of the universe, suspended as if from some transcendental and invisible point above, as reflected in the patient's dream. Many of the themes that we have been discussing are expressed in this single dream. In it, we find examples of the subtle body process, the monstrous dark sun, the solar plexus, alchemical transformation, the Nigredo, the mortificatio, and the self. We see the process of psychic transformation expressed as the dream ego engages the darkness of the psyche and leads toward an enigmatic and symbolic vision that deepens his psychic life. Now we look at a more extensive case vignette in which the black sun plays a prominent role. In it, a pastoral counselor struggles with this image and is thrown into an encounter with psychic realities that challenge his worldview. The pastor, whose work I am about to describe, became aware of my research and offered to tell me about his experiences. We corresponded for a little more than 3 months, during which time he elaborated his struggle with Saul Niger and his developing understanding of the image. His first experience with the black sun was in the context of his ongoing Jungian analysis. The image of Saul Niger emerged in an active imagination. He drew a picture of it. In the drawing, there are 2 human figures. He is on the left, and a slightly larger figure of a cowboy is on right. The cowboy had appeared in other active imaginations and played the role of the guide. The figures are looking out into the desert, where there is a large golden pyramid with a bright yellow color surrounding it. Up above is a large black sun. It is important to note that the image appeared roughly 6 months before he began to experience a deepening depression, which lasted for about 3 years. He felt that there was some link between his depression and the image of the black sun that appeared in his vision. Shortly after he had the experience of the image, things began to shift in his life. He left the institution where he was doing chaplaincy work. He separated from his wife of 17 years, a marriage that had long-standing problems, and was soon to leave his analysis as well. He was working and living alone for the first time in his life, and his depression continued to worsen. When he told this to his analyst, the analyst said, "No, you aren't getting worse. You're getting better." Because he didn't believe that the analyst understood his angst over his depression, he left analysis. He felt that he had to get away from the analyst to literally save his life. He struggled with the depression for another 1.5 years with help from another therapist, medication, and a group he was in, but finally reached the point where he was simply not functioning. He went into a hospital during the next year for a total of 8 months, was discharged, and gradually began to put his life back in order. Following his hospitalization, he struggled with many aspects of Saul Niger, including a masculine-feminine split, and issues of the heart, death, suicide, and obsessionality, as well as with what he called a black hole and spiritual transformation. One of the first things he did upon visualizing the image of the black sun was to look through Jung's works for references. One particular passage impressed him immediately, though it was not until a good deal later that he started to experience what his intuition told him was important. This is the passage he found. Despite all attempts at denial and obfuscation, there is an unconscious factor, a black sun, which is responsible for the surprisingly common phenomenon of masculine split-mindedness when the right hand mustn't know what the left is doing. The split is in the masculine psyche, and the regular darkening of the moon and woman together explain the remarkable fact that the woman is accused of all darkness in a man, while he himself basks in the thought that he is a veritable fount of vitality and illumination for all the females in his environment. Actually, he would be better advised to shroud the brilliance of his mind in the profoundest doubt. His personal experience strongly resonated with Jung's description, and he wrote in a letter, "My relationships with women have never been particularly satisfactory. I like women and get along well as friends and colleagues, but intimacy has been difficult. This was the case in my marriage, and in the couple of relationships I have been involved with since then. Since dealing with the black sun, I have recognized a lot in myself that the Jung passage implies, and have come to see that this has been at least part of what has been at the heart of my difficulties with women. There were several things that the pastor was almost entirely unaware of before his experience of the black sun. One was his tendency to blame women for his problems. He had done this for years, and even though women, including his former wife, complained about the kind of superiority, hostility, and condescension that can come from such an attitude, he simply could never see it. He always felt himself to be in the right, and usually wondered what in the world was wrong with him that they could not see it the way he did. However, he did have the insight that a lot of his feeling life had been deeply buried for a long time. He began to sense that the feelings of which he was unaware were manifested in the ways he experienced and dealt with women. For example, he writes that he had been guilty sometimes of falling into an automatic teaching-lecturing posture with women. He then became aware that this was set off when women expressed their ideas through feelings. It was as if he then had to counter this with his superior intellect, because he could not deal with it on the feeling level. He realized that he believed that a woman's feelings were inferior, and that she needed his bright intellect to enlighten her. For him, feeling was part of the unknown, and thus part of the black sun, which he feared. The pastor reflected that in relation to the black sun, whatever its ultimate significance, a man needs somehow to come to terms with these feelings of superiority in order to also be aware of the duality in himself. If a man can do this, then he might not have to project the unseen aspect onto a woman, a displacement that had occurred not only for himself, but also for other men with whom he had worked professionally, or who were his friends and colleagues. While he knew this kind of attitude could be very hard to make conscious, he never really believed that it was buried in him. According to Jung, men often prefer to see their thinking associated with the light of consciousness, and thus it is very easy for them to project their own dark moods and thoughts upon women. Although the pastor did not think of it in this context, after writing to me about the preceding observations, he recalled an earlier encounter with the theme of Saul Niger in the heart. One day, he had developed a pain around his heart and had gone to the emergency room at a hospital, but the doctors found nothing physically wrong. 1 week from that day, the same thing happened, and he went back to the hospital, and again, nothing was found. When he next went to see his analyst and told him what had happened, the analyst suggested that since nothing physical was found, the problem must lie elsewhere. He suggested that the pastor do some active imagination in relationship to the heart to see what might happen. For 14 days in a row, he actively imagined what was going on in his heart, and each time he drew a picture of what he had seen. He came to relate what he had considered his masculine-feminine split to problems of the heart that he traced back to wounds associated with his father. As he meditated and actively imagined what was going on inside his heart, he saw an angry fist, a crowbar, a large black stake piercing his heart, and later a large black iron ball that later he had identified with the black sun. He speculated on the relationship between depression and heart disease, and commented that it cannot be healthy to carry around a 24-pound ball of iron in your heart. The work with active imagination eventually led him to a healing process. Images of a surgical procedure and the extraction of the iron ball, a black snake with green vegetation leading the way to the emergence of blue waters, and a dolphin accompanying a small sailboat in the final picture of the series. The image that most struck him, however, was the black iron ball that had emerged and was now outside. Although there was a healing of the heart, this image pointed to something outside of himself and outside the realm of consciousness. For him, it was some darker expression of the soul, instinctual, emotional, symbolic, and archetypal. At its core, the darkness of this other was uncanny and strange, and perhaps even unknowable, he thought. It could have devastating consequences physiologically and in his relationships, and it was as unrecognized as a black hole. The theme of a black hole became important to him as an outer image that helped him to grapple with his inner darkness. Just becoming aware that such things exist in the universe helped him when he felt he was losing his sanity, or even becoming a bit psychotic. He began to do some spontaneous active imagination on the model of a black hole. He writes that when he was in the throes of the depression, he would draw a blackened circle on a piece of paper. Then, when he looked at it and realized what he had drawn, he was horrified by it. It was as if it was able to draw attention and consciousness right down into it. As he thought more about what black holes are, he was able to see that they did exactly the same thing in the outer universe that the inner image had been doing to him. Black holes are so dense that no light escapes them. There were times when his depression felt exactly like that. In addition, he had the sense that he could literally be pulled down into this thing and lost, in just the way things do not come out of black holes, at least not where they went in. At one point, the pastor's concerns turned toward death, and he reflected on it as it appeared in his depressive states. He connected death with the black sun. He noted that the primary way that thoughts about death entered in was with the preoccupation that he was going to die. The pattern was that the death thought would be most prominent from the morning into early evening, but through the late evening it would subside completely. He would then go to bed somewhat peacefully, and then in the morning it would start again. This continued over a 3-year period. Every morning for 3 years he woke with the same concern about death. During that whole time, not once did it make any difference on any of those mornings that he knew the fear had subsided the night before, and had done so every time. Every single day was a repeat of the identical pattern, seemingly disconnected from the day before. Although he felt that the ultimate significance of his death thoughts was symbolic, for a long time he experienced the thought on a literal level. It took the form of preoccupation with his actual death. I don't know when that awareness of the literal quality of these thoughts began to change, but it did. I think it changed a good deal in relationship to the spiritual changes which eventually came through a kind of death, rebirth process. In studying the material on the tomb of Ramses VI, he was struck by the following phrase: "The rebirth of the sun at dawn after its nighttime netherworld journey, the resurrection of the king after his dark and difficult passage through the underworld following his death, and the emergence of a higher level of consciousness after the arduous and often terrifying examination." He felt this well described what he went through. I think I have had to live with the black sun for these past years to get ready to deal with the further meaning. There is work to be done, though. I think part of it will be more precise thinking and amplifications regarding the black sun. In other words, there is still unanswered somewhat the question, why the black sun? Why a black sun? It was a question the pastor knew could never be fully answered through analysis or therapy. He noted that his dark experiences, like the sun, had an incredible, seemingly inexhaustible energy. Probably the most significant thing for him with regard to the whole experience is that it eventually led him to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church. He had previously been ordained as a Protestant minister for 23 years. He felt that because of the depth to which the whole experience of the depression in the Black Sun took him, it ultimately resulted in a spiritual revolution. Since becoming Russian Orthodox 7 years ago, he has continued to understand some things through the spirituality of that tradition that continued the theme of the Black Sun. He began to offer a number of reflections on the relationship of the Black Sun and the dark side of God. He stated that, in Orthodoxy, it is common to think about God both in terms of positive and negative theology. This is not unique to Orthodoxy either. The positive theology involves those clear affirmations we are willing to make about God. That God is love, that God is omnipresent, etc. The negative theology proceeds in a different way, and basically is the encounter with God through the experience of being stripped of our delusions and illusions about God and ourselves. My sense is that this corresponds more to the idea of the essence of God. Now, with all said, the place I am coming to in regard to Saul Niger is to say that what it has of God in it is close to this dark, mysterious aspect of God. One way that I have seen, that has been in terms of the change which I experienced in relation to the image. Initially, it was terrifying and something that I wanted to flee, but could not. Saul Niger and the depression made him aware of things that had to be faced and dealt with on the psychological level. At the same time, however, he had come to see that all of these factors needed spiritual work as well. In other words, what Saul Niger and the depression revealed to him about his soul, he had come to see in his relationship to God as well. While this might sound strange, if the psychological and the spiritual are different but intimately related dimensions, then each will need its own kind of work. The pastor found that Orthodoxy offers a form of meditative prayer known as hesycham, a term that means solitude or quietness, and that was first used by St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. It has to do with what was described as an uncreated light. This form of prayer uses the Jesus prayer, which leads to the direct perception of God and the things of God. The uncreated light is also called the Taborian light, because it is the light that shone forth from Christ at his transfiguration on Mount Tabor. It is a light that comes from God, and is not a created light like other light, such as that from the daytime sun. Other saints have reportedly actually shone forth with this light, which is exceedingly brilliant. He sometimes wondered whether that uncreated light might not in some way be connected with the dazzling light that proceeds from Saul Niger. The pastor and I had discussed the work of Julia Kristeva, and he felt that his idea is amplified in her work when she says, the Black Sun again takes up the semantic field of Saturnine, but pulls it inside out, like a glove. Darkness flashes as a solar light, which nevertheless remains dazzling with black invisibility. However, for Kristeva, Saul Niger seems to remain tied to states of depression. The pastor reflected, in this is seen again the paradoxical notion of light, dazzling flashes, in the black darkness, black invisibility. Ever since the Saul Niger began to take on some positive characteristics, this has been my intuition about it, that it is dark, but light-given. For the pastor, the reconciliation of light and darkness is captured in the Orthodox way by Kallistos Ware, who talks about negative theology. And so it proves to be for each one who follows the spiritual way. We go out from the known into the unknown. We advance from light into darkness. We do not simply proceed from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, but we go forward from the light of partial knowledge into a greater knowledge, which is so much more profound that it can only be described as the darkness of unknowing. Though this is clearly a statement about spiritual awareness, It is interesting that the darkness is actually seen as an advance over light and a greater knowledge than the light of partial knowledge. When reflecting on the pastor's experience, one might imagine an individuation process and the spiritual telos of his depression, leading to an integration of both his personal and archetypal shadow. Such an integration might be said to have constellated a well-integrated self, healing a split in his masculine consciousness and ultimately opening him to an experience of a numinous, dark God image at the core of his new faith. This process ends with the creation of an important image relevant to our experience of Saul Niger, with a darkness of unknowing, which is strangely described as an advance over light and as a blinding divine darkness. This image of divine darkness is a well-known aspect of mystical theology. Mystical theology. The theology of the 5th or 6th century mystical philosopher Pseudo-Dionysius further amplifies Saul Niger in its luminescent aspect. Many have come to discern in his writing the hand of a brilliant epistemologist, an early philosopher of language, a Socrates-like teacher, and a mystical theologian. Perhaps the best designation of Pseudo-Dionysius is the one underlined by 20th century philosopher and theologian Edith Stein, father of mysticism. For Stein, his theology represents the highest stage of secret revelation, and she notes that the higher the knowledge, the darker and more mysterious it is, the less it can be put into words. In short, the ascent to God is an ascent into darkness and silence. In his letters, Pseudo-Dionysius writes, "The divine darkness is that unapproachable light where God is said to live." In another place he writes, "The pure absolute and immutable mysteries of theology are veiled in the dazzling obscurity of the secret silence, outshining all brilliance with the intensity of their darkness." His mystical theology has been considered to exemplify the Dionysian method, and to be a key to the structure of the entire corpus. Pseudo-Dionysius begins with the question, "What is divine darkness?" and responds that divine darkness is made manifest only to those who travel through foul and fair, who pass beyond the summit of every holy ascent, who leave behind them every divine light, every voice, every word from heaven, and who plunge into the darkness where there dwells the one who is beyond all things. According to the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, what remains of what can be known is not soul or mind, nor does it possess imagination, conviction, speech, or understanding. Nor is it speech per se. It cannot be spoken of, and it cannot be grasped by understanding. It is not number or order, greatness or smallness, equality or inequality, similarity or dissimilarity. It is not immovable, moving, or at rest. It has no power. It is not power, nor is it light. It does not live, nor is it life. It is not a substance, nor is it eternity or time. It cannot be grasped by the understanding, since it is neither knowledge nor truth. It is not kingship. It is not wisdom. It is neither one nor oneness, divinity nor goodness. Nor is it a spirit in the sense in which we understand that term. It is not sonship or fatherhood, and it is nothing known to us or to any other being. It falls neither within the predicate of non-being nor of being. Existing beings do not know it as it actually is, and it does not know them as they are. There is no speaking of it, nor name, nor knowledge of it. Darkness and light, error and truth. It is none of these. It is beyond assertion and denial. In such a litany, one gets the experience of the process of negative theology, which has a tendency to reduce one both to silence and to a darkness that one cannot even call darkness. So, in an attempt to continue to express what the author is referring to, the image of divine darkness stands in the place of having nothing left to say. Throughout his text, we find the metaphors of a darkness of unknowing that is higher than knowledge, a cloud of unknowing, he who has made the shadow his hiding place, a darkness hidden by light, a nakedness that exceeds light, a brilliant darkness resplendent, a dazzling obscurity of secret silence, a ray of divine shadow that exceeds all existence, an outshining of all brilliance with the intensity of darkness, a supra-essential divine darkness beyond affirmation and negation, mystical ecstasy, a transcendent energy that lifts up beyond sense and intellect, and an eclipse of consciousness that drives one out of one's mind and leaves one in silence. For Jung, such images are mad and monstrous, the height of paradox, linking and transcending what we think of as opposites in such a way that ordinary consciousness is radically challenged and subverted. In Silver and White Earth, Hillman speaks of such madness alchemically as a process in which solar brilliance and moon madness are marvelously conjoined. The Mysterium Conjunctionis, then, is illumined lunacy. However, if, with Hillman, we have ended in being out of our minds with lunacy, it is only fair to say that it is a higher kind of lunacy, a lunacy that is not simply deprivation and solely associated with the moon, depression, or castration, but a lunacy of transcendence, perhaps better associated with art and poetry than literal madness. In Theodore Roethke's poem, In a Dark Time, he writes that the eye begins to see, and in this darkness he meets his shadow, and the darkness deepens. Here in the dark he finds both madness and nobility of soul, an odd correspondence of opposites. Roethke also documents the via longissima that leads to the death of the self, set in a blazing unnatural light, the point where the eye no longer recognizes itself, but finds the mind of God and a sense of freedom in the pain of loss. Indeed, the poem contains several images associated with Saul Niger: pure despair, death of the self, dark light, the nobility of the soul, and madness, all of which form a complex web that may well constitute a kind of lunacy. Chapter 5, continued. Nothingness and the no-self. It was such a higher lunacy that laid the ground for Jung's more rational, intellectual, and scientific ideas about the self. Jungian analyst Murray Stein, in Jung's Map of the Soul, does a nice job of tracing Jung's primordial experience of the self, and I quote only a small part that is relevant to our reflections here. He describes a point in Jung's life in 1916 when Jung had a strange visionary experience that led to his writing a Gnostic-like text called the Seven Sermons to the Dead. Jung heard the following words, which he transcribed. Hearken, I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as fullness. In infinity, full is no better than empty. Nothingness is both empty and full. As well might ye say anything else of nothingness, as for instance, white is it, or black, or again it is not, or is it? This nothingness or fullness, let us name the pleroma. This pleroma was a Gnostic name given to Jung's experiential prefiguration of what later became his hypothesis of the self. This concept was elaborated throughout many of the collected works, but most fully expressed in Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. According to Jung, the self was a concept difficult to define and, in spite of all of his warnings, it is often taken as a substantialized entity. Perhaps it would be of use to remind ourselves that Jung's self is not a metaphysical entity. Psychologist and scholar Roger Brooke makes a useful contribution by asserting that to think of the self as a something is less accurate than to understand it as a no-thing, a fertile and hospitable emptiness within which the things of the world could shine forth. In an article that has received too little attention, Nothing Almost Sees Miracles, Self and No-Self in Psychology and Religion, scholar of religion and Jungian psychology David Miller writes what amounts to a deconstructive reading of Jung's idea of the self. He claims that even though Jung ultimately rejects the idea of a no-self doctrine, in essence what he means by the idea of the self has the same ontological status as the desubstantialized and deconstructed notion of the no-self in the apophatic religious traditions. Self is no self. Turning to the margins of Jung's ideas beyond the formulations of his ideas as an empirical scientist, Miller recalls Jung's comment: "If you will contemplate your nothingness, your lack of fantasy, lack of inspiration, and lack of inner aliveness, which you feel as sheer stagnation and a barren wilderness, and impregnate it with the interest born of alarm at your inner death, then something can take shape in you. For your inner emptiness conceals just as great a fullness, if you allow it to penetrate into you. An emptiness that is also a fullness resonates with figures such as Pseudo-Dionysius, Meister Eckhart, Lao Tzu, and other masters of Asian or Western philosophies and religions that hold the concept of nothingness at the core of psychological and religious life. In essence, this is true for Jung too. For beyond the scientific Jung is the alchemical Jung, for whom the so-called self is, in principle, unknown and unknowable. This Jung follows the alchemical dictum, ignotium per ignotius. The unknown is explained by the more unknown. In short, for Jung, the self is tantamount to religion's no-self. The paradoxical tension between self and no-self that Miller describes is a point of philosophical debate and doctrinal complexity that reaches a high point in Asian philosophy and religion in the dialogue between Hindu and Buddhist perspectives. The debate is relevant for understanding Jung's idea of the self, since this idea was modeled in part on the ancient Hindu notion of Atman, Brahman. The Upanishadic perspective holds that beneath and or above the flux of the empirical world is an unchanging and eternal self at the core of the universe. Buddhist philosophy, on the other hand, rejects such an idea of an unchanging self and considers any idea of the self to be an impermanent construction that must be seen through. In the place of the self Atman, the Buddhists see anatman, or no self, and sunyata, nothingness or voidness, as a mark of the real. The theme of this debate has been taken up by transpersonal psychologist Sean Kelly. He contributes to this debate, positing what he calls complex holism, a view in part influenced by Hegel's, Jung's, and Morin's idea of a dialectic that is a symbiotic combination of two or more logics in a manner that is at once complementary and antagonistic. What's important in Kelly's position is not just the idea of bringing the two perspectives together in unity, but also giving importance to their differences. This gives his vision nuance and complexity. In other words, the doctrine that holds the self, the Hindu Atman, Brahman, as the supreme principle, and the doctrine that holds the no-self, the Buddhist anatta, as a supreme principle, are complementary while at the same time remaining antagonistic. Kelly relativizes each fundamental idea by noting that both principles must negate the truth of the other in order to point out its one-sidedness and its missing complement. It appears that Kelly's idea is parallel to Jung's. Jung's psychology was originally called complex psychology, and later, as it developed, an important component of it was the idea that the unconscious compensates for the one-sided attitudes of the conscious mind with the intent of achieving balance and wholeness. For Jung, the self was also a complex holism, a self-regulating and balancing principle. But what is interesting in Kelly's argument is that he applies the idea of complementarity to the idea of the self itself. He observes that the concept of the self as Atman is prone to the kind of sterile hypostatization that impedes rather than facilitates psychic life. On the other hand, without the stability of the Atmanic self, the no-self anatta doctrine is also prone to a sterile nihilism that leaves psychic life adrift. It is worth noting here that for each perspective, Hindu or Buddhist, the idea of a complementarity principle can be accounted for from within. The Atman Brahman perspective has its own way of understanding the flux of the no-self, just as the no-self perspective of the Buddhists has its own way of understanding stability. Those who are committed to one perspective or another are likely to feel that the antagonistic other does not really understand its perspective, which from within its own point of view, the ideas of its critics are already addressed. Those who hold to their own perspectives alone are traditionally considered orthodox, whereas those who seek to break with tradition may be seen as iconoclastic or even heretical, like Jung himself. The history of ideas and cultures seems to move by virtue of such dialectic, though ultimately this may be a too limited way to imagine the complexity of history. Kelly's perspective of complex holism embraces both perspectives, self and no-self. To this dialogical complementarity, he adds the either-or of dialogic antagonism, which gives the debate a dynamic thrust that both affirms and relativizes at the same time. If we then imagine Jung's idea of the self as being subject to a similar critique, the self would call for the complementarity principle of no-self to keep it from stagnating into an hypostasized and fixed idea of order, as Hillman has observed. For Jung as well as Hillman, the self as the archetype of meaning requires the anima or archetype of life to keep it from stagnation. Hillman, however, prefers not to speak of the self at all because of its tendency as a transcendental concept to lose connection with the body. For him, the problem with Jung's idea of the self is that it moves toward transcendence, both mathematical and geometric. Its analogies tend to be drawn from the realm of spirit, abstract philosophy, and mystical theology. Its principles tend to be expressed in terms such as self-actualization and telechy, the principle of individuation, the monad, the totality, Atman, Brahman, and the Tao. For Hillman, all of this points to a vision of self that is removed from life, and so it enters psychology through the back door, disguised as synchronicity, magic, oracles, science fiction, self-symbolism, mandalas, tarot, astrology, and other indiscriminations, equally prophetic, ahistorical, and humorless. Here, Hillman brings together a variety of ideas and images, sacred to the orthodox Jungians, which, while not well differentiated, serve the purpose of painting a vision of the self as an unconscious, abstract structure that has lost touch with the dynamics of the soul. This is a view of the self that is not acceptable to the orthodox Jungian, for whom the self is both structural, dynamic, and deeply connected to life. It is not surprising to find that fundamental concepts such as the self are open to multiple interpretations. As noted, there are those who regard Jung's self as anything but static, and others for whom it too easily loses itself in a hypostasized, outmoded, out of touch, and abstract conception that calls out for revision. As I interpret Kelly's perspective of complex holism, the importance of the tension is to reveal how every fundamental concept has a shadow, even when the concept is as wide-ranging as the self. In this sense, the complementary antagonistic idea of the no-self reveals the self's shadow as an esoteric and invisible other that is necessary to the animation of psychic life. Traditionally, the shadow is considered to be the counterpart of consciousness, but the self is said to embrace both the conscious and the unconscious dimensions of psychic life. However, if one follows Jung in the most radical sense, while simultaneously giving credence to the perspectives of Miller and Kelly, and to the importance of the idea of the no-self as being both complementary and antagonistic to Jung's idea of the self, then it is reasonable to imagine the self as having a shadow, a dynamic and invisible otherness that is essential to it. Often for alchemy, Sol is the most precious thing, while Sol Niger as its shadow is like Lacan's pt.5. This pt.5 is more worthless than seaweed. Yet, without Sol Niger, there is no ring to consciousness, no dynamic other that taints and tinctures the brilliance of the sun. Following the alchemical tradition, Jung writes that consciousness requires as its necessary counterpart a dark, latent, non-manifest side. So much did the alchemists sense the duality of his unconscious assumptions that, in the face of all astronomical evidence, he equipped the sun with a shadow and stated, The sun and its shadow bring the work to perfection. Ultimately, I believe the notion of a shadow of the self is supported by the paradoxical play of opposites in alchemy. Rapture, depth psychology, and the soul. From the beginning of this chapter, we have been grappling with the idea of antinomies, with the paradoxical play of light and dark, life and death, spirit and matter. The coincidentia oppositorum and mysterium conjunctionis are expressions of paradox and monstrosity, maddening negations, and attempts at unification or transcendence. In an attempt to understand Saul Niger, we have explored the divine darkness of mystical theology, the tension between Hindu and Buddhist visions, and the idea of a complex holism that lends itself to a new way of imagining both the Jungian idea of the self as well as of Saul Niger. As we have seen, the problem is, how can we speak about whatever it is that is referred to in the preceding? How can we address that invisible or absent presence that we call the self or no-self, divine darkness, or Saul Niger? It has been challenging for the ancient philosophers, religious mystics, and alchemists, as well as for contemporary post-structuralist philosophers and psychoanalysts, to grapple with expressing what is often felt to be inexpressible. For post-structuralist sensibilities, one difficulty that is often expressed is that in every attempt to name that absent presence, there remains a vestige of metaphysical speculation, a transcendental signified, for our purposes read as self, that is not deconstructed. The French post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Derrida, for example, finds this to be the case with regard to negative theology, which his thought resembles, but from which he insists it differs. In his How to Avoid Speaking, Denials, he takes up his relationship with negative theology. This which is called X is neither this nor that, neither sensible nor intelligible, neither positive nor negative, neither inside nor outside, neither superior nor inferior, neither active nor passive, neither present nor absent, not even neutral, not even subject to a dialectic with the third movement, without any possible sublation, au fibum. Despite appearances, then, this X is neither a concept nor even a name. It does lend itself to a series of names, but calls for another syntax, and exceeds even the order and the structure of predictive discourse. It is not, and does not say what is. It is written completely otherwise. While mimicking Pseudo-Dionysius, Derrida might be said to write negative theology otherwise, in a way that does not assume a supreme being beyond the categories of being. Following Heidegger, he elaborates the postmodern practice of sous-rapture, which has been translated as under erasure, to mark the paradoxical play of the absence of a presence, an always already absent present, of the lack at the origin that is the condition of thought and experience. In Jungian terms, one might think of this with regard to the mysterious core of an archetype itself, which can never be made fully present or conscious. When we speak of God or self, we are naming something whose being is never fully present and cannot be captured in any signification. Even to speak of it as having a core or as being something is problematic. In Jungian language, we speak of images of the self, but what does it mean to speak of this self as if it existed as a kind of independent presence or transcendentally signified object or being? We have seen that, in negative theology, trying to name such transcendental objects always falls short, and that they can be referred to only in terms such as divine darkness, which does not seem to refer to anything at all. If no word or sign can capture the transcendental notion of God or being or the self, and so on, then the words or signs that refer to it must be put under erasure, or crossed out, since the word is inaccurate. However, since all signs or words are necessary, but also share the same lack, the convention has been to print both the word or sign and its deletion. Derrida gives this example. The sign, crossed out, is that ill-named, crossed out thing, that escapes the instituting question of philosophy. Likewise, if we speak of God, being, or self, the convention would dictate that we express such ideas under erasure as crossed out God, crossed out being, and crossed out self.